I finally exposed public humiliation in my marriage, took back control, and watched a manipulative spouse lose power when I stopped playing her game. It started innocently enough. We were at our usual spot downtown, the kind of place where conversations flow as freely as the wine. But then she began her routine right in front of everyone. She launched into this elaborate story about how I'd wasted money on what she called another one of my ridiculous investments. The table went quiet. This wasn't playful teasing between spouses. This was calculated. He actually thought buying those stocks would make us rich, she said with that laugh that cut through the air like a blade. I told him it was stupid, but does he listen? Never. The friends around us shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was the 4th time this month she'd done something like this in public. But here's the thing about being pushed too far. Something clicks. Something fundamental changes inside you. As she continued her performance, describing how irresponsible and naive I was with money, I found myself studying her face, really studying it. The way she glanced around the table, making sure everyone was absorbing her words. The slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth when she saw people nodding along. This wasn't about the money. This wasn't even about being right or wrong. This was about control, pure, calculated control. She was using our friends as weapons, turning every social gathering into a courtroom where she was both prosecutor and judge. I took a slow sip of my drink and set it down carefully. The table was still focused on her as she wrapped up her latest character assassination. But when she finally looked at me, expecting the usual sheepish apology or defensive scrambling, she found something different. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. She blinked, clearly caught off guard by my calm tone. "What?" "I asked if you were finished with your performance." I leaned back in my chair, completely relaxed. "Because I've been watching you work, and I have to admit, you're good at this. Really good." The table fell silent. Our friends looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. She tried to laugh it off, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Sure, you do. You pick a public setting. You choose a topic that makes me look foolish. You deliver it with just the right mix of concern and disappointment. And then you sit back and watch everyone nod along with your version of events." I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "It's actually quite sophisticated." She started to speak, but I held up a hand. "The investment you're talking about, it's up 12% this month. But you knew that, didn't you? You checked the account this morning, same as every morning, so this isn't really about money." The silence stretched out like a taut wire. I could feel the shift in the room's energy. Our friends were looking at her now, waiting for her response, but she had nothing. For the first time in years, she had absolutely nothing. "This is about something else entirely," I continued, my voice steady and calm. "And I think it's time we talked about what that something else actually is, don't you?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. But no words came. The woman who always had the perfect cutting remark, who could slice through any conversation with surgical precision, was speechless. I stood up from the table, pulled out my wallet, and left enough cash to cover both our meals and a generous tip. "I'll be in the car when you're ready to have that conversation," I said, looking directly at her. "Take your time." As I walked toward the exit, I could hear the uncomfortable murmur of voices behind me. But I didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, I wasn't the one left explaining myself. I wasn't the one making excuses or apologizing for existing. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I realized something had fundamentally changed. Not just in that restaurant, not just in that moment, but in me. The game had new rules now, and this time, I wasn't going to be the only one playing by them. I leaned against the car and waited because I knew she'd come. She had to. The alternative was staying in that restaurant, facing the questions she couldn't answer, dealing with the looks she couldn't explain. 10 minutes later, she emerged from the restaurant, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. But underneath that anger, I could see something else. Something I hadn't seen in years: uncertainty. The drive home was going to be very interesting. The car ride home was 20 minutes of pure silence. Not the comfortable kind you share with someone you love, but the heavy, suffocating kind that comes before a storm. She kept glancing at me, waiting for me to break first, to apologize, to fall back into the familiar pattern. But I just drove, completely calm, like nothing had happened. When we got home, she finally exploded. "What the hell was that back there?" I hung up my keys and turned to face her. That was me not playing along anymore. Playing along with what? I was just telling the truth about your stupid investment. No, I said, walking to the kitchen and pouring myself a glass of water. You were performing. There's a difference. She followed me, her heels clicking angrily on the hardwood floor. You embarrassed me in front of our friends. I almost laughed. I embarrassed you? That's rich. I took a slow sip of water and looked at her directly. Tell me, when was the last time we were in public and you didn't find some way to make me look foolish? She opened her mouth to argue, but I could see the wheels turning. She was trying to remember, coming up empty. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, setting down my glass. This stops, all of it. The public humiliation, the calculated put-downs, the little performances designed to make me look like an idiot. It ends now. You can't tell me what to do, she snapped. But there was something different in her voice, less certainty. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I won't tolerate anymore. Big difference. The next few days were like living with a caged animal. She tested boundaries, looking for weaknesses, trying to find the old buttons to push. But every time she tried to slip back into the old patterns, I called it out immediately. No drama, no shouting, just calm observation. You're doing it again, I'd say when she started to criticize my choice of restaurant in front of the waiter. She'd stop mid-sentence, frustrated and confused. The real test came the following weekend at her sister's birthday dinner. Family gatherings were her specialty, her home turf, where she could really shine. I knew she'd try something and she didn't disappoint. We were all seated around the dining room table when she started her routine. You know, he's been acting so strange lately, she announced to the room, gesturing at me like I wasn't sitting right there. I think he's having some kind of midlife crisis. The family chuckled politely, but I could see them watching for my reaction. This was the moment. She was betting that I wouldn't challenge her in front of her family, that I'd revert to the old patterns. I smiled and leaned forward slightly. Actually, I've been thinking about that too, about strange behavior and patterns. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. Have you ever noticed how some people use public settings to say things they'd never say in private? It's fascinating, really. Her sister looked confused. What do you mean? Well, take criticism for example. In a healthy relationship, if you have a concern about your partner, you discuss it privately, right? But some people prefer an audience. They wait until there are witnesses before they share their concerns. I made air quotes, still smiling pleasantly. Her mother nodded slowly. That does seem unusual, right? It's almost like they're not actually trying to solve a problem or communicate. It's more like they're trying to... I paused, pretending to search for the right word, perform, create a narrative. My wife's face was getting red, but she couldn't interrupt without proving my point. The family was listening now, really listening. I mean, if someone really thought their spouse was having a crisis, wouldn't the loving thing be to talk to them privately? Maybe offer support. I took a sip of wine. Using it as dinner conversation seems, I don't know, strategic. Her father, who'd always been sharp, was looking at her now with new eyes. That's a good point. Communication should be private first. Exactly, I said, still maintaining that pleasant conversational tone. I actually brought this up with a colleague who's a therapist. She said that when someone consistently brings private matters into public forums, it's usually about control, not concern. The silence that followed was deafening. My wife was trapped. If she defended herself, she'd be admitting to the behavior. If she stayed quiet, the point stood unchallenged. Her sister cleared her throat. Well, that's certainly something to think about. Oh, absolutely, I agreed. I've learned so much about communication patterns lately. It's amazing how much clearer things become when you really pay attention to what people do versus what they say they're doing. My wife excused herself to the bathroom, and I knew she was regrouping, trying to figure out her next move. But the damage was done. Her family had seen the pattern, had it pointed out in a way they couldn't ignore. When she came back, she was quieter. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, but I could feel her watching me, reassessing, trying to figure out this new version of her husband who didn't just absorb her attacks anymore. On the drive home, she finally spoke. You think you're so smart, don't you? I think I'm tired of being treated like I'm stupid, I replied calmly. There's a difference. This isn't over. I glanced at her and smiled. No, it's not. But the rules have changed. You might want to adjust your strategy accordingly. She turned to stare out the window, and I could practically hear her mind working, plotting, planning her next move. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't worried about what that move might be. because I finally understood the game we'd been playing. And now that I knew the rules, I intended to win. She didn't waste any time. By Monday morning, my phone was buzzing with concerned messages from colleagues. Apparently, she'd been busy over the weekend, reaching out to people from my work, sharing her concerns about my recent behavior. The messages were almost identical. "Hey, your wife called, said, you've been stressed lately. Everything okay?" It was subtle but effective. She was painting me as unstable, unreliable, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. Smart move. If she couldn't control me directly anymore, she'd go for my professional reputation, attack my credibility before I could damage hers further. I sat in my office scrolling through the messages, and I had to admire the strategy. She'd learned from our previous encounters. No more direct confrontation where I could expose her tactics in real time. This was guerrilla warfare, hitting my reputation from angles I couldn't immediately defend. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how well people actually knew me. By Tuesday, the narrative started falling apart. My boss called me into his office, not with concern, but with confusion. "Look, I don't know what's going on at home," he said, closing the door behind us. "But your wife called yesterday, very concerned about your mental state. Said, you've been making erratic decisions, acting unpredictably." I nodded calmly. "What did you tell her?" He frowned. "That's just it. I told her, you've been fine, more than fine actually, sharp as ever." She seemed surprised by that. I bet she did. "The thing is," he continued, leaning against his desk, "she asked some very specific questions about your work performance, your reliability, whether I'd noticed any changes. It felt less like a concerned wife and more like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like someone building a case." "Exactly." He studied my face. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" I considered my options. I could play it off, make excuses, try to smooth things over, or I could trust that my work spoke for itself. My wife has a pattern of trying to undermine me when she doesn't get her way. Usually she keeps it to social settings, but apparently she's expanding her reach. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's concerning." "It is, but it's also revealing. When someone resorts to attacking your professional reputation, it means they've run out of legitimate grievances." The conversation shifted something in the office dynamic. Word travels fast in small workplaces, and by Wednesday, I could tell people were looking at the situation differently. She'd overplayed her hand, and it was backfiring. But she wasn't done. Thursday evening, I came home to find her on the phone with my mother, voice thick with artificial concern. "I'm just so worried about him," she was saying. "He's been acting so different, so cold and calculating. It's like he's become someone else entirely." I stood in the doorway, listening to her performance. It was good. I had to give her that. The tremor in her voice, the carefully placed pauses, the way she made herself sound like a victim trying to save her marriage. But she hadn't noticed me yet, and I could hear my mother's responses. They weren't what she was expecting. "Well, dear," my mother was saying, "maybe he's just finally standing up for himself. You have been quite critical of him lately." My wife's voice shifted, became more urgent. "But you don't understand. He's been so hostile, so aggressive. Last weekend at dinner, he practically attacked me in front of my family." "Attacked you? That doesn't sound like him at all." "He's changed, I'm telling you. I think he might need professional help." That's when I stepped into the room. "Mom," I said, extending my hand for the phone. My wife's face went white. She'd been caught in the act, spinning her narrative to my own family. "Hi, sweetheart." My mother's voice came through the speaker. "Your wife was just expressing some concerns about you." "I heard," I said, looking directly at my wife as I spoke. "But I think there might be some confusion about what's actually happening here." My wife tried to grab the phone back, but I stepped away, keeping my voice calm and measured. "Mom, have you ever noticed that she only shares these concerns about me with other people? Never directly with me?" There was a pause. "Now that you mention it." In fact, in the past month, every conversation we've had about our relationship has happened because I initiated it. She prefers to discuss our problems with everyone except me. My wife was making frantic gestures, trying to get me to stop, but I was just getting started. She called my boss this week, told him I was mentally unstable. She's been texting my colleagues, expressing concern about my judgment, but she hasn't asked me once how I'm doing or if there's anything bothering me. "That does seem backward," my mother said slowly. "It's because this isn't about concern, Mom. This is about control. When someone can't win an argument on merit, they try to discredit the other person instead." My wife finally found her voice. That's not true. I am concerned. I've been what? I interrupted, still holding the phone. Setting boundaries, refusing to be humiliated in public, calling out manipulative behavior when I see it. The silence stretched out. My mother could hear everything, and my wife knew it. Mom, I continued, I want you to do me a favor. Next time she calls you with concerns about my behavior, ask her one simple question. Have you talked to him about this directly? I guarantee you the answer will be no. After I hung up, my wife stood there shaking with rage. You had no right to do that. I had every right to defend myself against false accusations, which is exactly what those were. I wasn't making false accusations. You were trying to isolate me, turn my family and colleagues against me so that when people saw our conflicts, they'd automatically assume I was the problem. I sat down in my chair, completely relaxed. It's actually a pretty sophisticated manipulation tactic. Too bad it only works when the target doesn't recognize what's happening. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Who are you? I'm the same person I've always been. The difference is I'm not pretending your behavior is normal anymore. She turned and stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. But I wasn't worried. Her network was crumbling. Her tactics were exposed. And people were starting to see the real dynamic in our relationship. The hunter had become the hunted, and she was running out of places to hide. Friday morning brought a new level of desperation. I woke up to find her sitting at the kitchen table with bank statements spread out like battle plans. She looked up when I entered, and I could see she'd been crying. Real tears this time, not the performed variety. We need to talk, she said, her voice shaky but determined. I poured myself coffee and sat across from her. I'm listening. I've been thinking about our finances, and I'm worried. Really worried. She gestured at the papers. Maybe we should separate our accounts just temporarily until you get some help. There it was. When public humiliation failed, when character assassination backfired, she was going nuclear, financial manipulation. The last resort of someone losing control. Help for what exactly? Your behavior. You've been so erratic, so unpredictable, making unilateral decisions, changing how you interact with people. Her voice was gaining strength as she warmed to her theme. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown. I sipped my coffee and studied the papers she'd laid out. Bank statements, investment portfolios, mortgage documents. She'd done her homework, identified every account, every asset. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment idea. When did you pull all these documents? That's not the point. The point is, no, that is exactly the point. I leaned forward. These statements are from 3 different banks, our investment account, which you never touch. Even the mortgage paperwork from 2 years ago. This took planning. She shifted uncomfortably. I was just being thorough. No, you were preparing, building a case. How long have you been working on this contingency plan? The question hung in the air like smoke. She couldn't answer without admitting she'd been planning financial warfare while pretending to be a concerned wife. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our neighborhood. You know what I realized yesterday? After talking to my mother, after seeing how my colleagues reacted to your little campaign, people don't trust someone who talks about their spouse the way you talk about me. I don't know what you mean. Sure you do. My boss didn't believe you when you said I was unstable because my work proves otherwise. My mother didn't buy your victim act because she's watched you criticize me for 3 years. Even your own family is starting to see the pattern. I turned back to face her. So now you're trying a different approach. If you can't convince people I'm crazy, maybe you can convince them I'm financially irresponsible. Control the money, control the narrative. That's not what this is about. Then put the papers away. She hesitated, her hands hovering over the documents. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. You can't, can you? Because this isn't about protecting our finances. This is about having leverage, something to hold over my head when the emotional manipulation stops working. I sat back down and pulled the bank statements toward me, scanning the numbers. Here's what's interesting. You want to separate accounts because you're worried about my judgment. But these statements show I've been the one managing our money responsibly for 3 years. Every successful investment, every debt payment, every financial decision that's improved our situation. That was me. She started to protest, but I held up the investment statement. This portfolio you called ridiculous at dinner last week? It's outperformed the market by 18% this year. Our mortgage, I refinanced it last spring and saved us $400 a month. The emergency fund. I built that while you were spending $300 a month on clothes you wear once. The color drained from her face. She'd been so focused on using money as a weapon that she'd forgotten I actually controlled our finances. But here's what I'm going to do, I continued, gathering the papers into a neat stack. I'm going to make this easy for you. We can separate our finances completely. Her eyes lit up, thinking she'd won. You'll take responsibility for exactly half of everything. Half the mortgage, half the utilities, half the household expenses. Your half will be due on the 1st of every month. No exceptions. The light in her eyes dimmed as she started doing the math. Of course, you'll also lose access to the investment accounts, since those were built with money I managed, and the emergency fund, since that was my initiative. You'll have your salary, which should be more than enough for your half of our expenses. Wait, that's not what I meant. No, then what did you mean? Because separating finances means separating financial responsibilities too. You can't have independence without accountability. She stared at the papers, realizing she'd backed herself into a corner. She'd threatened financial separation as a manipulation tactic, not expecting me to call her bluff. I don't think that's fair, she said weakly. Really? You just told me you were worried about my financial judgment. Now you're saying you don't want to be financially independent. Which is it? The trap was perfect. If she backed down, she'd be admitting the whole thing was a manipulation. If she went forward, she'd be taking on financial responsibility she wasn't prepared for. I need time to think about this, she finally said. Of course. Take all the time you need. I stood up and handed her the stack of papers. But while you're thinking, maybe consider this. Every manipulation tactic you've tried has not only failed, but made your position worse. The public humiliation backfired and exposed your behavior. The character assassination campaign turned people against you. And now this financial threat has given me a reason to separate our accounts completely. I headed toward the door, then paused. It's almost like fighting fair would have been the better strategy all along. She sat there, staring at the papers, surrounded by the evidence of her own miscalculations. For someone who thought she was playing chess, she made an awful lot of checker moves. The weekend was quiet. She stayed in the bedroom most of Saturday, making phone calls I couldn't quite hear, but could certainly imagine. Sunday morning, I found her at the kitchen table again, but this time she looked defeated. I don't want to separate our finances, she said without looking up. I figured as much, but the offer stands. Anytime you feel I'm not managing our money responsibly, we can revisit it. She nodded, but I could see the wheels still turning. She wasn't giving up, just regrouping again. The woman who'd once controlled every conversation, every social dynamic, every aspect of our relationship was running out of weapons. But cornered animals are often the most dangerous. I had a feeling her next move would be her most desperate yet. The final blow came at what should have been a routine neighborhood barbecue. 3 weeks had passed since the financial threat backfired, and I could sense her desperation growing. She'd been quieter at home, but I knew that silence meant she was planning something bigger. She found her opportunity when our neighbor brought up the community fundraiser for the local school. The conversation naturally turned to volunteering and civic responsibility, and I saw the gleam in her eyes. This was it. Her grand finale. You know, she said, loud enough for the entire patio to hear, I wish I could count on my husband to help with community things, but he's become so selfish lately. Everything has to be about him. The group fell silent. After weeks of failed manipulation attempts, she was going back to her original playbook, but cranking it up to 11. Just last week I asked him to help my elderly neighbor with her groceries, and he refused, said he was too busy. She shook her head sadly. I don't know what happened to the man I married. This was her masterpiece, public, devastating, and completely fabricated. She was betting that no one would fact-check a story about helping elderly neighbors, but she'd forgotten one crucial detail. Mrs. Patterson, I called out, looking across the yard to where our elderly neighbor was sitting with her daughter. Mrs. Patterson looked up, confused. Yes, dear. Could you come over here for a second? My wife just told an interesting story about last week, and I think you might want to hear it. The color drained from my wife's face as Mrs. Patterson walked over, her daughter following curiously behind. What's this about groceries? Mrs. Patterson asked, looking between us. I smiled calmly. My wife just told everyone that she asked me to help you with groceries last week, and I refused because I was too selfish and busy. Mrs. Patterson frowned. That's strange. You helped me with groceries on Tuesday, same as you do every Tuesday. Have for 6 months now. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person at that barbecue was staring at my wife, waiting for an explanation that would never come. In fact, Mrs. Patterson continued, warming to the subject, "You wouldn't let me pay you for gas money," said helping neighbors was just what people should do. Her daughter nodded. "Mom's told me about how helpful you've been. Always so reliable." My wife's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She'd been caught in a lie so blatant, so easily disproven, that there was no way to spin it. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she finally managed. "No misunderstanding," I said quietly. "You made up a story to make me look bad in front of our neighbors. The same way you made up concerns about my mental health to my colleagues. The same way you exaggerated our financial situation to justify separating accounts. The neighborhood barbecue had become a courtroom, and she was the defendant without a defense. The thing is," I continued, addressing the group but keeping my voice conversational, "when someone consistently lies about their spouse in public, it says more about them than it does about the spouse." The host of our neighborhood's barbecue cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe we should talk about something else." "Absolutely," I agreed. "I think we've all learned enough about character for one evening." As the group dispersed into smaller conversations, my wife stood frozen in place. She played her final card and not only lost the hand but revealed herself as a cheat to everyone at the table. Mrs. Patterson patted my arm before walking away. "Some people just can't stand to see others happy," she said, loud enough for my wife to hear. The drive home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than we'd shared before. This wasn't tension or anger. This was the quiet that comes after a storm has passed, and the damage is being assessed. "You've destroyed everything," she said as we pulled into our driveway. "No," I replied, turning off the engine. "I defended myself against lies. There's a difference." She sat there for a moment, staring at our house like she was seeing it for the first time. "People will never look at me the same way again." "That's true, but that's not my fault. That's the natural consequence of your choices. What happens now?" I looked at her. This woman who'd spent 3 years trying to control me through public humiliation and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, complete calm. "Now you decide who you want to be, the person who learns from this and changes, or the person who keeps fighting a war she's already lost." She got out of the car without another word, and I knew the decision had already been made. 3 days after the barbecue incident, she came downstairs with 2 suitcases. I was reading the morning paper when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking smaller somehow than she had in years. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while," she announced, setting the bags down. I folded the paper and looked at her. "How long is a while?" "I don't know, maybe permanently." Her voice was flat, defeated. "I can't live like this anymore." "Like what?" "Like everyone sees through me. Like I can't say anything without people wondering if it's true." She sat down across from me but wouldn't meet my eyes. "Do you know what my sister said when I called her?" She asked if the story about Mrs. Patterson was another one of my exaggerations. I nodded. "Your family's not stupid. They've been watching this pattern for years, just like everyone else." "So what, you win? Is that it?" "This was never about winning. This was about respect. Mine and yours." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean, mine?" "You think anyone respected the woman who constantly tore down her husband in public? You think people admired someone who lied about helping elderly neighbors? You didn't just damage my reputation, you destroyed your own." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on controlling the narrative that she'd never considered how the narrative made her look. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said quietly. "Yes, you did. Every time I tried to address it privately, you escalated. Every boundary I set, you tested. This is exactly as far as you meant for it to go." She was quiet for several minutes, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What if I changed? What if I stopped? Then you'd be a different person than the one who packed those bags." I gestured toward her suitcases. "But change isn't something you do for other people. It's something you do for yourself. And us? Is there an us to save?" I considered the question seriously. "That depends on whether you can live with a husband who won't be your punching bag anymore, who won't tolerate public humiliation or manipulation, who calls out lies the moment they're told." She winced. "You make me sound horrible." "I make you sound like someone who used shame as a weapon, because that's what you did." She stood up abruptly, grabbing her suitcases. "Maybe some space will be good for both of us. Maybe it will." At the door she paused. "What will you tell people when they ask where I am?" The truth, that you're taking time to think about what kind of person you want to be. She flinched again, but nodded. And if I decide I want to come back, then we'll have a conversation about what that looks like. But it won't look like the last 3 years. After she left, I sat in the quiet house and realized something remarkable. For the first time since we'd gotten married, I felt peace, not happiness, not satisfaction, but genuine peace. My phone buzzed throughout the day. Word traveled fast in our circle, and people wanted to know what happened. I kept my responses simple and honest. She was taking time to figure things out. We were both taking time to figure things out. Mrs. Patterson called that evening. I heard she moved out. You doing okay, sweetheart? I'm doing fine, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for asking. Good. You know, I never said anything before, but that girl never seemed happy unless she was making someone else miserable. Well, she'll have plenty of time to work on that now. 2 weeks later, she called. I've been thinking about what you said about change, and I started seeing someone, a counselor. She says, I have issues with control and self-worth. That sounds like a good start. She also says that the way I treated you was emotionally abusive. I was quiet for a moment. What do you think? I think she's right, and I think I need to do a lot more work before I can be anyone's wife. That takes courage to admit, not as much courage as it took to finally stand up to me. 3 months later, the divorce papers were signed, amicable, fair, and final. She kept the house in the settlement, but I'd already bought a place closer to downtown anyway. At the final hearing, she approached me outside the courthouse. I wanted to thank you, she said. For what? For not letting me destroy myself completely. If you'd kept taking it, I would have kept getting worse. I nodded. Take care of yourself. You too. And I'm sorry for all of it. As I drove away from the courthouse, I thought about the man I'd been 3 years ago. Someone who accepted disrespect as normal, who apologized for existing, who let himself be diminished in public for the sake of keeping peace. That man was gone. In his place was someone who knew his worth, who demanded respect, and who understood that real strength isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about knowing when to fight and how to win. The woman who tried to use shame as a weapon had learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the person you're trying to break is stronger than you think, and sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to prove it. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.